All right, well, what we got today was a budget of broken promises. The NDP promised you, British Columbia taxpayers, a whole lot of things. And what we're seeing today is none of it. The average rents are up $2,400. Condo insurance is rising. ICBC rates are so unaffordable for kids that they can't afford to insure their cars to go to university. You've got to ask yourself today, am I better off today? Because I was promised affordability and it's just not here.
Well, I think one of the significant concerns I continue to have is the fact that there is no economic strategy for growing the economy in British Columbia. We continue to see that increasing taxes seems to be the most convenient and effective way for this government to raise money. And in fact, since I actually made my remarks in the legislature, we found another tax. We're actually up to 23 and counting. There is going to be, PST will now be charged on streaming services in British Columbia. So, for example, if you use Netflix or some other streaming service, we've just discovered that, in fact, that is another new tax. So just in the time we walked from the legislature, we're up to 23 new and increased taxes. We need to see a robust, thoughtful, strategic growth plan in British Columbia. That's completely non-existent in the budget we saw today. Yeah. So we'll take some questions.
There are going to be people that say, you know, people making over $220,000. Yeah, they can pay a little more. I'm not too plussed about this new tax increase. What do you say to them?
Well, look, you don't have to ask us. You saw it before. When tax structures get too uncompetitive, people just leave.
And one of the things we continue to hear across British Columbia, whether it's small business or bigger business, medium-sized enterprises, the lack of competitiveness when it comes to the tax regime, to regulation and a variety of other things, is causing serious reputational damage to British Columbia. People are choosing not to invest here. So, you know, from our perspective, you can see what happens when the tax rates are not competitive. People simply choose to leave our province.
I was interested in the capital side. They got a $30-odd billion spending plan on the capital side. They got 15. It takes 15 pages to list the projects underway, and there's an apparent need for every one of them, I assume. Did you leave BC undersourced or under cutting out their assets? Did you not quite make the mark when it comes to meeting people's needs? No. Is that why they have to build all this stuff?
No, there's going to be an ongoing need for infrastructure. We see it in Surrey. The NDP promised there would be no more portables in Surrey, but there is no more money in the budget, no mention of Surrey schools in this budget. The reality is that last year, and in the budget documents, it's right out there in the numbers for you, they promised over $1 billion more in spending than they actually did. They're not delivering. So it's promises, but it isn't materializing. And there is risk with the rate at which they want to spend. Is it stuff we need? Absolutely. We need money for Surrey SkyTrain, that's not in here. We need money for Surrey Hospital, that's not in here. So there's lots of promises that have been made, but it's actually seeing it in the ground that counts.
Well, not only that, Les, we live in a province where we need to renew infrastructure. And if you look, for example, at hospitals in northern British Columbia, they were all built around a similar period of time. So it's not a matter of investing one time, it's a matter of ongoing investment in British Columbia. So of course there's going to be a large capital building program. There was under our government, there will continue to be under this government as well. But I think the surprising part for us was there was a promise to spend $1 billion more than they actually spent in terms of infrastructure. We're seeing projects that are being stretched in terms of the time they're taking. We see the capital plan now being spread over 5 years instead of 3. All of those changes speak to the financial circumstances that this government is facing. And, you know, from our perspective, it's really easy to talk about affordability. But the question we're asking British Columbians today is, do you feel like you're any better off? And the fact of the matter is we have the highest gasoline prices, we have a strata crisis, which is enormously concerning. Not a word about that in the budget. So, you know, day after day, we hear this government tout the fact that affordability matters, when in fact, I think many British Columbians would tell you that they don't feel any better off. And that's what the budget showed us today.
What do you think of the tax on sugary drinks?
Sorry?
The tax on sugary drinks. They added the PST to soda and that kind of thing. Is that one of the 23 that you're counting, or is that?
Yes, it is.
And
Yep.
what do you think of it?
Well, again, I think that making sure we look after the health and wellness of the young people and people who consume those drinks in British Columbia is important. As to the efficacy of a tax like that, I'm not sure what that will do. So, you know, from our perspective, there are times when adding a tax does make a difference. But I'm sure that Netflix users are going to be very surprised to find out that their streaming service has now had the PST. We were surprised to find it, actually. After we left the legislature, we're up to 23 new and increased taxes. And I think the more important point is, I mean, we could discuss each tax individually, but the fact of the matter is that taxation revenue under this government has increased exponentially.
Yeah.
And where do you think that money comes from? The taxpayers' back pocket, hard-working British Columbians. And I think that's completely lost in the narrative that you read in this budget.
Yeah.
Steph, you mentioned ICBC.
Yeah.
We finally see it now back in the black, forecast moving forward past this year, with a promised 20% rebate on average for all British Columbians. So how can you say that this government has not addressed affordability in the public insurance?
Well, I think I'd be curious to look at the numbers behind that. Just a few months ago, we were told that there was going to be a $50 million deficit this year, ballooned to 91, and that they hadn't accounted yet for the loss in court that was going to cost approximately $400 million. There's no mention of how they've managed to absorb that in the last few months with the changes that they've made. Not to mention that they've now announced they're going to freeze fees all of a sudden, no rate increases. And then they're flatlining the expected projections for the insurance company over the next number of years while they transition to an entirely new model of insurance, which has its own set of consequences that we have yet to see any numbers on. So I'm not confident in the numbers around ICBC at this point in time, and we'll reserve judgment on that once we get a little more detail.
There are zero details in this budget about the impact of moving to a no-fault system, zero. And we continue to see flatline projections and an assumption. If you look back to last year's budget, the assumption was that ICBC, as a result of some of the changes made, would be back in the black this year. That is not what we've seen. And in fact, there is zero details about any of the impacts of going to a no-fault system in this budget. So I agree with Stephanie. We have zero confidence in the numbers that are presented for ICBC, and we'll wait and see what the system does in terms of the fiscal impacts.
And you're also concerned about there's 9,000 cases that are going to be settled under the old model as well.
That's right.
Exactly.
Do you see these pressures that, are we concerned that that's not accounted for either in terms of the upward pressure on those 9,000?
Well, I think if you look at the fact that under the NDP, ICBC lost $2 billion in 2 years, and now miraculously is in the black. I think we have to look carefully at the projections and really question whether or not the numbers going forward are somehow all of a sudden more accurate. The reality is that those 9,000 cases that have yet to settle, not to mention any accidents that happen between now and the date that no fault could or should come into effect, the reality is all of those, that could be a 4-year time frame before those are settled. So there's still a lot of uncertainty in how this moves forward, and ICBC is certainly one of the areas we'll be paying very close attention.
One of your caucus colleagues mentioned he'd be looking for a Christmas budget as the speculation as to whether we're going to have an election before 2021 has been, percolating. Does this look like a Christmas budget to you? Does this look like the NDP government trying to court voters before going back to the polls?
Well, given that they promised $10 a day daycare for everyone, and the budget for that is flatlining at 1/3 of the cost of providing that care, I'd say no. The reality is that the $10 a day daycare promise is dead. We're basically where we're going to be with daycare in the province because they haven't added more money. We've got the same sort of thing when it comes to, we're going to solve everybody's housing challenges. The reality is there's no $400 renter's rebate. It's not in this budget. It wasn't in the last budget. It wasn't in the budget before that, but they promised it in the election, and rents have gone up. and rents are going to keep going up. Housing affordability is no better when it comes to those who want to buy their first homes. I don't see anything in here for them. So the reality is that this budget is a fairly stand-pat budget, proving that the NDP has basically run out of money. And they're going to hold the line, but that means not delivering any new goodies for anyone either.
Thanks a lot.
Great,
Well,
thanks
can
everyone.
I just ask you an off-topic question here? There was protesters at the Premier's house today. What are your thoughts on that?
Totally unacceptable. The Premier's home is the Premier's home. If people want to protest and they have the right to voice their opinions, they can do that on public grounds.
You know, as someone who's served British Columbians for a long time, there are certain lines that, you know, I think our families deserve, and I think British Columbians would agree. You know, that's crossing the line from my perspective. You know, we may agree to disagree with the Premier on many things, but ensuring that his family and his home are safe, and that he is safe, is an important part of public service. So unacceptable. It shouldn't happen to anyone who's in public office, and it's unfortunate that it happened to the Premier today.